The morning of April 18th, 1943, Bougainville Island, 9:34 a.m. local time. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in the cramped passenger compartment of a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, his white-gloved hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. Through the small window, jungle canopy rushed past below as the pilot descended toward Balalae Airfield. In exactly 11 minutes, the architect of Pearl Harbor would be shaking hands with fighter pilots at a forward base. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Delivering a morale speech he'd rehearsed the night before. The schedule, transmitted 3 days earlier in encrypted naval code, specified his arrival time, down to the minute. 9:45 a.m. Yamamoto was nothing if not punctual. What the Admiral didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that 435 miles to the south, 16 P-38 Lightning fighters had taken off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal at precisely 7:25 that morning. What he didn't know was that American cryptanalysts had spent 14 hours breaking the JN-25D cipher that contained his itinerary. What he didn't know was that at this exact moment, Major John Mitchell was calculating wind drift corrections, bringing his formation to an intercept point that had been plotted with slide rule precision. The Americans knew his altitude, they knew his escort strength, they knew his exact arrival time, and they had calculated, down to the minute, when and where his bomber would be most vulnerable. 9:35 a.m., 10 minutes before landing, while descending over the jungle, with escort fighters caught between patrol altitude and defensive positioning. This is the story of Operation Vengeance. Not a story of luck or courage, though both played their parts. This is a story about the transformation of war itself, about how the age of cryptographic intelligence made it possible to reach across hundreds of miles of ocean and sky to place 16 fighters at a precise coordinate, at a precise moment, to intercept one man who believed his movements were secret, about how the United States demonstrated, in the most personal way imaginable, that Japan's naval codes had been broken, and about what that capability meant for every operation, every movement, every strategic decision the Japanese Navy would attempt for the rest of the war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not in the sky over Bougainville, but in the basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor, 4 days earlier, April 14th, 1943. Station Hypo, later redesignated Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, or FRUPAC, occupied a space that had once served routine administrative purposes. Now it housed what was arguably America's most valuable Pacific War asset, the Codebreakers. By April of 1943, the cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had been waging their own war for 16 months, not with bullets or bombs, but with IBM punch card sorting machines, pencils, and extraordinary human intellect. Their enemy was JN-25, the Japanese Navy's primary operational code. Not a simple substitution cipher, but a super-enciphered code system that combined a codebook of 90,000 groups with an additive encryption layer. Breaking it required first stripping away the numerical encipherment to reveal the underlying code groups, then inferring the meaning of each group through context, pattern analysis, and cross-referencing with other messages. The men who did this work, Commander William Goggins, Marine Colonel Alva Red Laswell, cryptanalysts Captain Tommy Dyer, and Commander Leslie Ham, Wright, and traffic analysts who included future Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, kept vast mental catalogues of code group meanings. They worked 36-hour shifts. They built card files containing hundreds of thousands of inference entries. They had accomplished something the Japanese High Command believed impossible. They had broken JN-25B before the Battle of Midway, allowing Admiral Nimitz to position his carriers for an ambush that destroyed 4 Japanese carriers. They had broken JN-25C, and by April of 1943, they were reading substantial portions of JN-25D, the latest version the Japanese believed to be secure. The message arrived in the early morning hours of April 14th, Hawaiian time, multiple U.S. radio intercept stations copied the transmission simultaneously. Sites in Hawaii, Australia, and Alaska all captured the same broadcast. The message itself stood out immediately, not because of its length or complexity, but because of the number of addressees. A message directed to Base Unit Number 1, the 11th Air Flotilla, and the 26th Air Flotilla suggested something operationally significant. The cryptanalysts went to work. The message had been encoded in JN-25D, and while the code had undergone changes following the January sinking of the Japanese submarine one off Guadalcanal when U.S. Navy divers had recovered material that aided decryption efforts, the codebreakers at Frupak had kept pace. Within hours, the message began to yield its secrets. And what emerged was extraordinary. Not battle orders, not fleet movements, but a travel itinerary. A detailed minute-by-minute schedule for an inspection tour. The message specified departure time, flight route, arrival time, aircraft types, and escort strength. And it identified the person making the journey, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. The man Americans held personally responsible for Pearl Harbor. The decoded message detailed a tour scheduled for April 18th. Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 6 a.m. Tokyo time, 8:10 a.m. local Solomon Islands time. He would fly in one of 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers, escorted by 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. His first stop would be Balalae Airfield near Bougainville, scheduled arrival 9:45 a.m. local time. The itinerary continued with visits to additional bases throughout the day. The message included everything except the one thing that would have saved Yamamoto's life. It didn't say that American cryptanalysts were reading it. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, grasped the implications immediately. He didn't walk to Admiral Chester Nimitz's office. He ran. Nimitz read the decoded message, then sent it up the chain of command. To Navy Secretary Frank Knox in Washington, and, according to some accounts, though no official record confirms it, Knox brought it to President Franklin Roosevelt. Whether Roosevelt personally gave the order or not, the decision came back unambiguous. Yamamoto was to be intercepted and killed. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor would not survive to plan another, but understanding Yamamoto's schedule and actually intercepting him were separated by 435 miles of ocean and several hundred Japanese aircraft based throughout the Solomon Islands. The order went to Admiral William Bull Halsey, Commander South Pacific. His message, transmitted on April 17th, read, "Tally ho, let's get the bastard." The operational planning fell to Admiral Mark Mitcher at Guadalcanal, and Mitcher knew immediately that only one aircraft type could execute the mission, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. In April of 1943, the P-38 represented the cutting edge of American fighter design, but it was also an aircraft that had evolved through necessity. The twin-boom, twin-engine configuration with its distinctive appearance that led Germans to call it the fork-tailed devil packed devastating firepower. 4 50-caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all concentrated in the nose, creating a cone of fire with no convergence issues to worry about. But its real value in the Pacific wasn't firepower, it was range. Navy F-4F Wildcats and Marine F-4U Corsairs were superb fighters, but they couldn't fly 900 miles round-trip with enough fuel remaining for combat. The P-38G models, stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, could, but only with external drop tanks, not the standard 75-gallon tanks, which extended range to 520 miles. For Operation Vengeance, they would need 165 or 310-gallon tanks, specially flown in for the mission. Even with these tanks, the round-trip distance of approximately 1,000 miles, 400 miles to the intercept point, following a circuitous route to avoid Japanese radar stations, then 400 miles back, with margins for combat and navigation errors, would push the P-38 to its absolute maximum range. The pilots would be flying for over 4 hours. Most of that time would be spent 50 feet above the ocean's surface, in radio silence, maintaining formation while burning fuel at cruise settings that allowed no margin for error. 10 minutes would be allocated for combat. 10 minutes to find, engage, and destroy Yamamoto's formation. Then, the long flight home on fumes. Major John Mitchell, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Squadron, received the mission briefing on April 17th. Mitchell had been on Guadalcanal through its darkest days, when Japanese forces had advanced to within 600 feet of the airstrip, when crew chiefs removed machine guns from aircraft to make a last-ditch defensive stand, when pilots dodged shell holes marked by bushes held in place by brave ground crew. He'd flown P-39 Airacobras before the Lightnings arrived, scoring 3 kills in an aircraft outmatched by the Zero. He'd been promoted to major in November 1942, then given command of the 339th when P-38 seconds finally gave American pilots a fighting chance. Now Admiral Mitchell was handing him the most important fighter mission of the Pacific War. The planning session crammed every senior officer on Guadalcanal into one bunker. Mitchell and Captain Tom Lanphier, one of his top pilots, stood at the edge of the crowd while Navy and Marine brass debated approaches. When the discussion bogged down over whether to attempt interception during a sea voyage, Mitchell's response was characteristically direct. "My men wouldn't know a sub-chaser from a sub. It'll have to be in the air." The attention turned back to the Army Air Force pilots who would actually fly the mission. Mitchell wanted 18 aircraft. 16 for the attack, 2 as spares in case of mechanical issues during takeoff. He wanted 4, designated as the killer flight, to attack the bombers directly. The remaining 12 would climb to 18,000 feet to provide top cover, engaging any Japanese fighters that attempted to interfere. He wanted Navy compasses, more reliable than Army Air Force issue for long-distance navigation over water, and he wanted those special drop tanks, which were already being welded onto aircraft by ground crews working through the night under tarps, their welding torches flickering like strange campfires in the tropical darkness. The route planning required precision that went beyond anything most fighter missions demanded. This wasn't a bomber escort or a combat air patrol. This was a fighter interception across hundreds of miles, timed to arrive at a specific point, at a specific moment, to engage an enemy who would be there for perhaps 30 seconds before passing out of range. Mitchell, Lanphier, and intelligence officer Joe McGuigan spread maps across a table and plotted a course that would keep them at least 50 miles away from Japanese-held islands. New Georgia, Vella La Vella, the Treasuries, all of which maintained radar stations and observation posts. The route would take them far to the south, then a curve north toward Bougainville's southwest coast. The mathematics were unforgiving. Yamamoto would be traveling at approximately 180 miles per hour in his G4M bomber. His scheduled arrival at Balalae was 9:45 a.m. Working backwards, if they wanted to intercept him 10 minutes before landing, while he was descending and most vulnerable, they needed to be at the intercept point at 9:35 a.m. The distance from Henderson Field to that point, approximately 400 miles. Flight time for P-38 seconds, flying at cruise power, just above the wave tops, 2 hours and 10 minutes, which meant wheels-up time had to be 7:25 a.m. No earlier, they couldn't afford to burn extra fuel circling the intercept point. No later, they'd miss Yamamoto entirely. The 16 pilots selected for the mission represented the best available. From Mitchell's 339th Fighter Squadron, from the 70th Fighter Squadron, from the 12th Fighter Squadron. Men like Rex Barber, who'd been flying Lightnings since the type arrived on Guadalcanal in December 1942, like Besby Holmes, like Doug Canning, whose call sign was Old Eagle Eyes for his ability to spot enemy aircraft at impossible distances. Like Raymond Hine, 18 pilots in total, though 2 would abort before reaching Bougainville. The killer flight would be led by Captain Tom Lanphier, with First Lieutenant Rex Barber as his wingman, and 2 others. The mission briefing was matter of fact. They were going to kill Admiral Yamamoto, not capture, not force down, kill. The message from Navy Secretary Knox, marked Top Secret, made the priorities clear. Squadron 339 P-38 must at all costs reach and destroy. President attaches extreme importance to mission. April 18th, 1943, 7:25 a.m., Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. 18 P-38 Lightnings began their takeoff roll. Each aircraft carried those enormous drop tanks 165 gallons under, each wing plus internal fuel and full ammunition loads. The Lightnings were heavy, sluggish on takeoff, but one by one they lifted off the steel matting that had been laid down over the mud and bomb craters that passed for a runway on Guadalcanal. Mitchell led the formation south, away from any Japanese observation posts, before beginning the long curve that would bring them to Bougainville from an unexpected direction. The flight profile was unlike anything fighter pilots normally flew. Instead of climbing to altitude where the P-38's turbo-supercharged engines gave them a significant advantage, they descended to 50 feet above the ocean's surface, sometimes lower, 10 feet. The prop wash kicked up spray. Pilots counted sharks in the water below, counted pieces of driftwood, did anything to stay awake during a flight that was 99% tedious navigation and 1% violent combat. They flew in complete radio silence, no calls, no chatter. Any transmission would alert Japanese radio intercept stations that American aircraft were operating in the area. Mitchell navigated by compass, time, and airspeed alone. No radar, no radio beacons, no GPS satellites that wouldn't be invented for another 40 years. Just careful dead reckoning, compensating for wind drift, maintaining formation, following a course plotted the night before on a map. The first leg, then the second, then the third. The sun climbed higher. The P-38 seconds droned on. Fuel gauges crept downward. The point of no return passed. They were committed now. Too far from Guadalcanal to turn back. Forward to Bougainville or ditch in the ocean when the fuel ran out. At approximately 9:32 a.m., Mitchell turned the formation northwest and began climbing. They'd reached the coast of Bougainville. 3 minutes to intercept time. The P-38 seconds clawed for altitude. Mitchell had calculated everything perfectly. The navigation, the timing, the route. Now they needed one more element. They needed Yamamoto to be exactly where the decoded message said he would be. Exactly when it said he'd be there. If the schedule had changed, if Yamamoto had departed Rabaul late, if Japanese communications had sent a route modification that the Codebreakers hadn't intercepted, if anything had disrupted the precision schedule laid out in that JN-25D message 4 days earlier, the P-38 seconds would find empty sky. They'd burn the last of their fuel searching, then ditch in the ocean or crash land on some Japanese-held island. The mission would fail, and Yamamoto would live. 9:33 a.m. The P-38 seconds continued climbing through 5,000 feet. Mitchell scanned the sky. Nothing. 9:34 a.m. Lieutenant Doug Canning's voice broke radio silence. 2 words that changed everything. Bogies, 11 o'clock. 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers in V formation, accompanied by 6 Zero fighters, exactly as the decoded message had specified. At exactly the altitude specified, at exactly the time calculated, Mitchell's navigation had been perfect, the Codebreakers' work had been perfect, and Yamamoto's legendary punctuality had just killed him. The fighters were perhaps half a mile away, slightly below the P-38 seconds altitude. The Americans had achieved complete surprise. The Japanese hadn't expected enemy fighters 400 miles from the nearest American base. They hadn't expected anyone to know about Yamamoto's schedule. They were cruising, unprepared, their defensive formation relaxed. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the P-38 seconds closed the distance. Mitchell's plan unfolded exactly as briefed. The 12-plane cover section, led by Mitchell himself, continued climbing to 18,000 feet to engage the Zero escorts. The 4-plane killer flight dropped their external fuel tanks and dove toward the bombers. But one of the killer flight, P-38 seconds, couldn't release its drop tanks. The external tank release mechanism had failed. With the tanks still attached, The Lightning couldn't maneuver effectively in combat. The pilot and his wingman had to pull up, unable to participate in the bomber attack. That left two P-38 seconds to engage two bombers defended by 6 Zeros, Captain Tom Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber, against an escort that was now fully alert and diving to defend the bombers. The two G4M bombers had seen the P-38 seconds. Their pilots pushed the controls forward, diving for the jungle canopy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The G4M, called Betty by Americans, was fast for a bomber, capable of 260 miles per hour, but it was also notoriously fragile. No armor, fuel tanks that, even when supposedly self-sealing, had a tendency to explode when hit. The Japanese had prioritized range and speed over protection, creating an aircraft that could deliver torpedoes across vast distances, but died quickly under fighter attack. Both bombers were now racing for the treetops, hoping the jungle would provide cover, hoping the Zero escorts would drive off the P-38 seconds before the American fighters could close within firing range. The Zero escorts were diving too, but they'd been caught out of position. They'd been flying 1,500 feet above the bombers, the standard escort formation. Now, they had to dive through that altitude differential, while the P-38 seconds, starting from only slightly above the bombers, had a much shorter distance to cover. The race was on. Could the Zeros reach defensive positions before the P-38 seconds reached firing range of the bombers? Lanphier and Barber went to full power. The twin Allison engines of their P-38 seconds screamed as the fighters accelerated in the dive. 3 Zeros turned hard toward Lanphier, forcing him into a defensive turn. That left Barber alone, closing on the lead bomber. What happened next would become one of aviation history's most disputed few seconds. Both Lanphier and Barber would claim to have shot down the bomber carrying Yamamoto. The controversy would last for decades, through Air Force review, the boards, through testimony from surviving Japanese pilots, through analysis of wreckage and bullet holes and flight paths. But in the moment, there was no ambiguity. There was only combat at 300 miles per hour, 50 feet above the jungle, with fuel running low and the entire Japanese garrison at Bougainville scrambling to intercept. Rex Barber, now the only killer flight P-38 still pursuing the bombers, closed on the lead G4M. He lined up behind and slightly below the bomber's tail. The range closed. 400 yards. 300. 200. His fingers tightened on the firing controls. The nose of his P-38 carried 4 50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon. All 5 weapons firing simultaneously produced a cone of fire that was devastating at close range. Barber opened fire. The tracers arced forward. He saw strikes on the bomber's left engine, on the tail section. Pieces flew off the G4M. Smoke poured from the left engine. The bomber's pilot tried to turn, tried to evade, but the damage was catastrophic. The left wing dipped. The bomber rolled left and slammed into the jungle canopy, cartwheeling through the trees before coming to rest in tangled wreckage. Barber had no time to confirm the kill. 3 Zeros were on his tail. He pulled hard right, away from the Zeros, looking for any other P-38 to form up with. Below him, the second G4M bomber was still flying, now being pursued by Besby Holmes and another P-38. That bomber wouldn't last long either. Under concentrated fire from multiple P-38 seconds, it crashed into the ocean off the coast. Above the engagement, Mitchell's cover section was fighting the Zero escorts, the sky filled with turning, climbing, diving aircraft. One P-38 went down Raymond Hine, shot down by a Zero that Japanese pilot Kenji Yanagiya later claimed to have damaged severely. Hine's Lightning crashed into the jungle. He didn't survive, but the Americans had accomplished their mission. Both bombers, destroyed, one in the jungle, one in the sea. And now, with fuel gauges showing almost empty, the surviving P-38 seconds turned south for the long flight home. The flight back was a race against fuel exhaustion. The external tanks were long gone, dropped during the climb to intercept. The internal tanks were draining fast. Pilots flew at the most economical cruise settings, calculating fuel consumption, estimating whether they'd make it back to Henderson Field or ditch in the ocean somewhere between Bougainville and Guadalcanal. Some of the P-38 seconds landed with fuel gauges reading 0. Others limped in with engines coughing, their tanks showing fumes where there should have been gallons. But 15 of the original 18 P-38 seconds made it back. Mitchell brought his formation over Henderson Field just before noon. Tom Lanphier broke radio silence with a transmission that would become famous. "That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House." Lanphier's statement, a misinterpretation of Yamamoto's actual views on how the war would end, captured American sentiment perfectly. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor was dead. The United States had demonstrated that it could reach hundreds of miles across enemy-controlled territory and strike with devastating precision. But the question remained, who, exactly, had fired the fatal shots? The initial debriefing was chaotic. There were no formal interrogation procedures established on Guadalcanal at that time. Pilots landed exhausted, dehydrated, adrenaline still surging. Lanphier immediately claimed he'd shot down the lead bomber, the one that crashed in the jungle. Barber said he'd shot down the same bomber. Both men were credited with kills. Holmes and another pilot received shared credit for the bomber that crashed in the sea. The mission report went up the chain of command marked Top Secret. All participating pilots received the Navy Cross. And the controversy that would last 60 years had begun. But before the truth could emerge from the chaos of debriefing, before historians could analyze flight paths and bullet trajectories, before Japanese survivors could provide their testimony, the immediate question facing American commanders was different. How do you announce this victory without revealing that you've broken Japan's naval codes? The security implications were staggering. Operation Vengeance had succeeded because American cryptanalysts could read JN-25D. That capability was worth more than one admiral's life. It was worth entire fleets, entire campaigns, entire strategic advantages that would persist for the remainder of the war. The codebreakers at Station Hypo had predicted Japanese movements at Midway, enabling the destruction of 4 carriers. They'd tracked Japanese shipping, allowing submarines to intercept convoys. They'd provided advance warning of operations throughout the Pacific. All of that depended on the Japanese continuing to believe their codes were secure. The decision was made to maintain absolute secrecy about the intelligence source. The official story would be that a routine patrol had spotted Yamamoto's formation by chance. To reinforce this cover story, American aircraft flew additional patrols in the area over the following days, creating the impression that the interception had been lucky rather than planned. The pilots who'd flown the mission were ordered not to discuss operational details. The existence of the decoded message was classified beyond top secret. And then, 6 months later, the security apparatus failed. In October 1943, Time magazine published an article about Operation Vengeance. The article mentioned the mission by name, it described the interception, and it specifically named Tom Lanphier as the pilot who'd shot down Yamamoto. The breach was catastrophic from a security perspective. U.S. Navy intelligence considered it a serious compromise of classified operations. There were immediate consequences. Major John Mitchell had been recommended for the Medal of Honor. That recommendation was downgraded to the Navy Cross, the same award given to all the pilots who'd flown the mission. The publicity had created a situation where rewarding Mitchell beyond his fellow pilots would draw even more attention to an operation that was supposed to remain obscure. The Japanese, reading the Time article and analyzing the circumstances of the interception, did draw conclusions. They knew their codes had been compromised, but they drew the wrong conclusion. They suspected that the Americans had broken their diplomatic codes, or perhaps a minor administrative cipher. They never suspected JN-25, their primary operational naval code. The Japanese Navy continued using JN-25 variants for the remainder of the war, making periodic updates but never implementing the complete overhaul that would have been necessary to restore security. The Americans continued reading it, continued gaining intelligence that shaped every major naval operation from 1943 through 1945. Meanwhile, on Bougainville, a Japanese search party was hacking through the jungle. They'd seen the smoke from the crashed bomber. They'd seen the wreckage. On April 19th, one day after the interception, they reached the crash site. What they found would become the subject of both official reports and near-mythical descriptions. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, still seated in his seat, thrown clear of the main wreckage but still strapped in. His white-gloved hand still gripping his samurai sword, his body, according to the official Japanese report, found in a state of great dignity. The autopsy revealed 2 wounds. One bullet had struck his jaw, another had hit his shoulder, travelling through to his chest. Medical personnel determined that Yamamoto had been killed before the aircraft crashed. The bullets had done their work during the brief seconds when Barber's P-38 had poured fire into the bomber. He died instantly or nearly so, probably never knowing that American fighters had intercepted him 400 miles from their base, never knowing that a message he'd authorized 4 days earlier had been read in Pearl Harbor within hours of transmission. The Japanese military faced a dilemma similar to the Americans. How do you announce the death of your most famous admiral without revealing that he'd been specifically targeted, which would suggest compromised communications? The Japanese government waited. For 33 days, Yamamoto's death remained a military secret. His body was cremated at Bougainville. His ashes were prepared for transport back to Japan, and on May 21st, 1943, the government made its announcement. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had died during combat operations at the front. The statement was technically true while omitting the specific circumstances that would have raised security questions. The impact on Japanese morale was devastating. Yamamoto had been more than a military commander. He'd been a symbol, a visionary, the architect of Japan's early victories. His name carried weight both within the military and among the civilian population. The announcement of his death triggered a period of national mourning. On June 5, 1943, Japan held a state funeral in Tokyo that drew 1 million mourners. Yamamoto's ashes, or rather, a portion of them, as Japanese custom divided. His remains were interred at Tama Cemetery in Tokyo and at his ancestral home in Nagaoka. The government posthumously promoted him to Marshal Admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy and awarded him Japan's highest honor, the Supreme Order of the Chrysanthemum. But the mourning couldn't change the strategic reality. The Japanese Navy had lost the one commander who truly understood both American capabilities and Japanese limitations. Yamamoto had spent years in America, had studied at Harvard, had observed American industrial capacity firsthand. He'd opposed the alliance with Germany. He'd warned Japanese leadership about the impossibility of winning a protracted war against American industrial might. His famous statement that he could run wild for 6 to 12 months, but had no confidence in victory beyond that had been proven prophetically accurate. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Midway had broken Japanese carrier strength. Now, 16 months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto himself was dead. His replacement, Admiral Minachi Koga, lacked Yamamoto's strategic insight. Koga would be followed by Admiral Soemu Toyoda. Neither would demonstrate the combination of tactical brilliance and strategic realism that Yamamoto had brought to Japanese naval command. The disastrous naval battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf in 1944 would be fought under their leadership, resulting in the effective destruction of Japanese naval aviation and the annihilation of the battleship force. Whether Yamamoto could have altered those outcomes is questionable. By 1944, American material superiority had become overwhelming, but his absence left a void that Japanese naval command never filled. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Back in the United States, the celebration was more subdued but no less significant. The pilots who'd flown Operation Vengeance were heroes, but heroes who couldn't fully explain what they'd accomplished. The mission remained classified. The intelligence breakthrough remained classified. The specific details remained classified. What the American public knew was limited to what Time magazine had reported, and official sources refused to either confirm or deny those details. For the pilots themselves, the aftermath brought both recognition and frustration. All 18 pilots who'd taken off from Henderson Field received the Navy Cross America's second highest military decoration after the Medal of Honor. But the question of who deserved credit for shooting down Yamamoto's aircraft created a controversy that would outlive most of the participants. The initial award citations gave Lanphier credit for 1 bomber destroyed and Barber credit for 1 bomber destroyed. Holmes and his wingman shared credit for the bomber that crashed into the sea. The official position was that both Lanphier and Barber had fired at the bomber that crashed in the jungle, the bomber carrying Yamamoto, and therefore both deserved credit. This seemed like a reasonable compromise in 1943, when the mission was still classified, and detailed analysis of the engagement was impossible. But as the war ended and more information became available, problems with Lanphier's account began to emerge. Lanphier claimed he'd approached the bomber from the side, fired at the right wing, and seen it separate from the aircraft before the bomber crashed. Barber's account was different. He said he'd approached from behind and below, fired at the tail and left engine, and saw the bomber roll left into the jungle. The accounts were incompatible. They couldn't both be describing the same attack on the same aircraft. Other pilots from the mission supported Barber's version. They'd seen Barber pursuing the lead bomber. They'd seen Lanphier engaged with 0 fighters. The geometry of the engagement suggested that Lanphier couldn't have been in position to fire at the bomber when he claimed to have done so. But Lanphier stuck to his story. In speeches, in magazine articles, in interviews over the decades, he maintained that he'd shot down Yamamoto. When Barber challenged this account, calling it inaccurate, Lanphier called him a liar. The dispute became personal, bitter, and increasingly public. The controversy might have remained a matter of competing narratives between 2 decorated veterans, except that additional evidence began to emerge. In the 1960s and 70s, Japanese survivors of the mission began providing testimony. The most significant came from Kenji Yanagiya, the 0 pilot who'd witnessed the bomber shoot-down. Yanagiya's account matched Barber's description exactly. He'd seen a P-38 approach from behind the bomber, not from the side. He'd seen the bomber take fire in the tail section and left engine, not the right wing. He'd seen it roll left into the jungle. Lanphier, according to Yanagiya, had been engaged with 0 fighters at the time, heading in the opposite direction from the bomber. Physical evidence supported this testimony. When researchers examined photographs of Yamamoto's crashed aircraft, which had been turned into a memorial shrine by the Japanese, the damage pattern matched Barber's description. The tail section showed heavy damage. The left engine showed damage. There was no evidence that the right wing had been shot off, as Lanphier claimed. When Barber returned to Henderson Field after the mission, his P-38 had 104 holes from combat damage evidence of both his attack on the bomber and his subsequent evasion of 0 fighters. He'd been in the thick of the fight, at close range, sustaining damage from return fire and near misses. In 1985, the U.S. Air Force convened a Victory Credit Board of Review to examine the evidence. The board reviewed combat reports, pilot testimonies, Japanese accounts, and physical evidence. Their conclusion: insufficient certainty existed to change the original shared credit determination. Both Lanphier and Barber would continue to share credit for the Yamamoto kill. In 1991, when Barber petitioned again for sole credit, Secretary of the Air Force Donald Rice upheld the shared credit ruling. Barber continued his campaign. He applied to the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to have the Air Force ruling overturned and the case re-investigated. The court declined to intervene. In 2003, after Barber's death in 2001, the governor and legislature of Oregon credited Barber with the sole kill after an independent analysis of the crash site and bullet impact patterns. But the U.S. Air Force refused to reverse its ruling. The controversy persisted into the 21st century. In 2024, military historian Daniel Hallman, who had served on the 1985 Air Force Review Panel, publicly stated that after reviewing additional evidence accumulated over the intervening decades, he'd changed his opinion. I have become convinced that, despite the panel decision and the subsequent Rice decision, credit for shooting down Yamamoto's plane really should go to Rex Barber. Hallman's statement carried weight. He'd been part of the original review process and had access to classified materials that shaped the 1985 decision. His reversal suggested that as more evidence emerged, the case for Barber's claim had strengthened significantly. But why does this matter? Why spend decades arguing over who fired the fatal shots in a combat engagement that lasted seconds? The controversy matters because it speaks to something larger than individual credit. It speaks to how we remember war, how we assign valor, how we determine historical truth when the participants disagree and the evidence is fragmentary. Tom Lanphier died in 1987, still claiming credit for the Yamamoto kill. Most newspaper obituaries credited him with the shootdown, reflecting the enduring power of his narrative despite the mounting evidence against it. Rex Barber died in 2001, having spent decades seeking recognition for what he believed he'd accomplished. The truth, insofar as historical truth, can be determined from conflicting accounts of events that occurred in seconds during chaotic aerial. The combat appears to favor Barber, but the official record remains unchanged. What's not controversial is the mission's success. Operation Vengeance accomplished exactly what it set out to accomplish. It removed Yamamoto from Japanese command. It demonstrated American intelligence capabilities to those who needed to know, while maintaining sufficient operational security to preserve the code-breaking advantage. And it provided a morale boost to American forces and the home front at a time when the Pacific War still seemed far from won. The broader impact of Operation Vengeance extended beyond Yamamoto's death. The mission demonstrated capabilities that shaped the remainder of the Pacific War. It showed that American fighters, properly equipped and intelligently employed, could execute precision strikes across distances that seemed impossible. It showed that code-breaking provided actionable intelligence that could be converted into operational success. And it showed that the United States was willing to dedicate significant resources to eliminating high-value targets when the opportunity arose. The code-breaking aspect deserves particular emphasis. The men at Station Hypo, the cryptanalysts who spent endless hours breaking JN-25, who built the card file systems that tracked code group meanings, who worked 36-hour shifts under fluorescent lights in a basement at Pearl Harbor, enabled Operation Vengeance just as surely as the pilots who flew it. Commander William Goggins, who'd taken over Station Hypo after the removal of Commander Joseph Rochefort in the bureaucratic infighting that followed Midway, led the unit that decrypted Yamamoto's itinerary. Marine Colonel Alva Red Laswell, the senior translator cryptographer, was the first to identify the significance of the message. Cryptanalysts Tommy Dyer and Ham Wright, who'd been breaking Japanese codes since before the war, provided the expertise that made the decryption possible. These men worked in obscurity. Their contributions remained classified for decades after the war. Joseph Rochefort, whose leadership had enabled the Midway victory, was rewarded with command of a floating dry dock, a deliberate slight that reflected the Navy's internal politics more than his actual performance. He carried guilt about Pearl Harbor to his grave, convinced that if he'd had more time to break the codes before December 7, 1941, thousands of lives could have been saved. The recognition he deserved came posthumously, long after his death in 1976. The Station Hypo Codebreakers represented a new kind of warfare, not the clash of fleets or the storming of beaches, but the quiet, meticulous work of breaking enemy communications and turning that intelligence into operational advantage. Every major American naval victory in the Pacific from Midway to the Philippine Sea was shaped by intelligence derived from broken Japanese codes. Submarine operations that strangled Japan's maritime supply lines depended on decrypted merchant ship position reports. The island-hopping campaign that brought American forces to Japan's doorstep was informed by intelligence about Japanese defensive preparations and troop movements. Operation Vengeance was perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of this intelligence capability, but it was far from the only application. The decision to specifically target and kill an enemy commander based on intercepted communications was unprecedented. It raised questions some asked at the time. Others asked in retrospect about the ethics of targeted assassination, even in wartime. Admiral Nimitz and his subordinates judged that the benefits of removing Yamamoto outweighed the risks of potentially compromising American code-breaking capabilities. History suggests they were right. The Japanese never fully grasped how comprehensively their naval codes had been broken. The pilots who flew Operation Vengeance went on to varied fates. Major John Mitchell, whose navigation had been so precise that he brought 16 P-38 seconds to the exact intercept point at the exact moment required, continued flying combat missions. He survived the war and lived until 1995, long enough to see the controversy over the Yamamoto kill play out across multiple Air Force review boards. Rex Barber flew a second combat tour in China, still in P-38 seconds, accumulating additional victories. He survived the war, became an engineer, and spent his later years campaigning for recognition of his role in the Yamamoto mission. Tom Lanphier became a colonel, worked in public relations, and maintained his claim to the Yamamoto kill until his death. Besby Holmes, who'd shared credit for the second bomber, continued his Air Force career. Doug Canning, whose bogies call had alerted the formation to the Japanese aircraft, flew additional combat missions and survived the war. Raymond Hine, shot down by Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya during the engagement, was the mission's only American fatality. His P-38 crashed in the Bougainville jungle. His remains were recovered after the war and returned to his family for burial. The P-38 Lightning itself became legendary in the Pacific. Lightning pilots shot down more Japanese aircraft than pilots of any other American fighter type. The two top American aces of World War II, Major Richard Bong with 40 kills and Major Thomas Maguire with 38, both flew P-38 seconds exclusively. The aircraft's long range made it ideal for Pacific operations, where distances between bases could stretch hundreds of miles. Its heavy firepower, concentrated in the nose, made it deadly in combat. Its twin-engine configuration provided redundancy that saved pilots when one engine was damaged. But the P-38 had limitations. It performed poorly in the European theatre, where high-altitude combat at temperatures far below those encountered in the Pacific revealed inadequate cockpit heating and engine problems. The turbo-supercharger intercooler system, housed in the wing leading edges on early models, proved vulnerable to combat damage. The shift to under-engine intercoolers in the J model, which gave the Lightning its distinctive chin appearance, came too late to fully address performance issues in Europe. The P-38 found its niche in the Pacific, where its range and firepower compensated for deficiencies that proved critical in other theatres. The legacy of Operation Vengeance extends into modern military doctrine. The mission established precedents for targeted strikes against high-value individuals based on intelligence intercepts. The debate over who shot down Yamamoto mirrors ongoing discussions about individual credit in operations that require extensive teamwork and support. The 16 P-38 seconds that flew to Bougainville depended on cryptanalysts who never left Pearl Harbor, on ground crews who installed drop tanks, on intelligence officers who plotted courses, and on commanders who authorized the mission. Assigning credit to one or two pilots, however accurate or inaccurate, diminishes the collaborative nature of the operation. Modern special operations, from the Bin Laden raid to drone strikes against terrorist leaders, echo elements of Operation Vengeance. Intelligence intercepts provide targeting information. Precision strikes eliminate specific individuals. The operations generate controversy about ethics, legality, and credit. The questions we ask about Yamamoto's death in 1943 remain relevant for targeted strikes in the 21st century. But there's a critical difference. Yamamoto was a uniformed military commander, flying in a military aircraft in a declared war zone. He was a legitimate military target under any interpretation of the laws of war. The legal and ethical questions surrounding his death are minimal compared to modern debates about drone strikes against non-state actors, about the definition of combatants, about the appropriate use of lethal force. Operation Vengeance faced no serious legal challenges. It was war. Yamamoto was the enemy. The United States had the intelligence and capability to kill him. The decision was straightforward. The psychological impact on Japan, however, exceeded the purely military consequences. Yamamoto represented continuity with Japan's earlier victories, with the success at Pearl Harbor, with the hope that Japan could negotiate a favorable peace through military dominance. His death severed that continuity. The commanders who replaced him, Koga, then Toyoda, lacked his strategic vision and his understanding of American capabilities. Their decisions would lead to catastrophic defeats in 1944 and 45, culminating in the destruction of Japan's remaining naval forces at Leyte Gulf and the reduction of the once mighty combined fleet to scattered remnants hiding in ports, short on fuel, short on trained pilots, short on any realistic hope of affecting the war's outcome. Could Yamamoto have changed that trajectory? Probably not. By mid-1943, American industrial production had reached levels that made Japanese defeat inevitable. The gap in aircraft production, in ship construction, in trained personnel, in raw materials, in every metric that mattered for sustained warfare, favored the United States by margins that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. But Yamamoto understood this. His warnings about Japan's inability to win a protracted war had been ignored. His death removed the one senior Japanese naval officer who might have advocated for a negotiated peace before the destruction became total. The irony is profound. The Americans killed the one Japanese admiral who'd argued against war with America. Yamamoto had opposed the tripartite pact with Germany. He'd warned that attacking the United States would awaken the industrial giant that Japan could not defeat. He'd planned Pearl Harbor because he'd been ordered to, not because he believed it would lead to Japanese victory. His famous statement about running wild for 6 to 12 months was not boastful. It was a warning. He was telling Japanese leadership that early victories were possible, but ultimate victory was not. They didn't listen. And now, 16 months after Pearl Harbor, he was dead. Killed by the very capability he'd helped demonstrate at Pearl Harbor, the ability to strike with surprise at a time and place where the enemy felt secure. The Americans had learned well. The encrypted message detailing his schedule, transmitted in a code the Japanese believed unbreakable, had enabled an interception across hundreds of miles. The precision navigation, the long-range fighters, the intelligence breakthrough, the operational security, all of it represented the kind of integrated military capability that only a nation with America's resources could sustain. The final irony. Yamamoto's inspection tour had been intended to boost Japanese morale after the loss of Guadalcanal. Instead, his death devastated morale far more than his presence could have boosted it. The mission, designed to show Japanese forces that their commanders cared about them, that senior officers would risk frontline visits, ended with the most senior commander dead in the jungle. The message received by Japanese forces was not, "Your leaders support you," but "American intelligence knows everything, and American fighters can reach anywhere." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.